Hi and welcome. I'm Jim Gopal, the CEO of Fathom Cyber. I'm a lawyer and an engineer, and I've written several books on controlled and classified information. I've been active in the CMMC ecosystem since its very early days, including creating and teaching the first official CMMC training course for the ecosystem. Regardless of whether you're a prime contractor or a subcontractor, if you supply goods or services that are used by the United States Department of Defense, the CMMC program is going to impact you. This video is being recorded in July 2025, and if you haven't done so already, I strongly urge you to start your CMMC journey now. Depending on your company's overall level of maturity, your organizational culture, and your budget, it can take as little as 6 months to get ready. But as a practical matter, if you're like most the companies in the defense supply chain, it'll likely take you 12 to 18 months to get ready. And then you still have to wait after you are ready for your certification assessment. Then you actually need to undergo the formal certification assessment. You'll have to wait for an assessment team to be ready and available to do it. And it's important to note that some of the CMMC third-party assessment organizations, the companies that actually run those and manage the assessments, they have wait lists that are almost a year long at this point. So unless you start the journey now and set a clear path with a clear end goal, your prime contractor may be forced to select somebody else instead of you to do the work on upcoming contracts until you can get all of this stuff done. So the sooner you can start this journey, the better off you are going to be and the more competitive you are going to be. Over the past 5 years, Fathom Cyber has advised many companies on their CMMC journey. There's an old Chinese proverb that says that the journey of a million miles begins with a single step. You've probably all heard that. We've learned through our experiences, we're helping companies get ready for CMMC, that the first few steps are often the hardest, but once you get rolling, the journey actually takes on a life of its own. So we've created this video to try to help you take those first couple steps. These are things that actually your organization can do on its own. We're here, we obviously want you to hire us as your consultant to help you with all this stuff, but quite frankly, there are some basic things that your organization can do without our help. You don't need us. So we wanted to help push things along, help get you ready, and give you some of the basic information that you need in order to begin your CMMC journey. We hope that this video will help you kickstart that process. And remember, again, if you need us along the way, we're here to help. But let's get started. We'll dig into that 12-step program. All right, so let's run through these 12 steps really quickly, and then we'll go through each one in more detail in an upcoming slide. First step is to inventory all of your assets, and we'll talk about what that means. And most importantly, we're going to inventory the information that is on those assets and the information that your organization handles. Then we're going to diagram the relationships between them. Those diagrams, as everybody knows, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Those diagrams are really helpful for helping you understand what's happening in your own environment and for helping the assessment teams understand what they're seeing in your environment. Then you're going to categorize those assets. It's really important to understand the role that they play, and the role that they play will vary depending on whether you're handling only federal contract information, that is non-public, unclassified information, or whether you're actually handling the more sensitive, still unclassified, but sensitive, what's called controlled unclassified information, or CUI. So depending on where you are and what kind of information you handle, that's going to determine or help you allocate those assets into different categories. Those categorizations, again, are going to be foundational for everything else that you're doing, because those determine, in step 4, those help you determine your scope. The scope means, what am I actually going to assess? What things are we going to have that third party come in and look at and say, okay, yes, this information system that is defined as in scope for this assessment, that it meets the requirements defined in either FAR 52-204-21 or in NIST Special Publication 800-171, depending on whether you only handle FCI or whether you handle CUI as well. Then once you've determined what your assessment scope is, the next thing is to conduct a gap assessment. We're going to look at where you are today versus where you need to be, and we're going to figure out a set of plans of actions to get you to done. We're also going to help create a system security plan that is a description of how your organization secures all of the information, how it safeguards the information that's entrusted to you. And then again, you're going to create those plans of actions. You're going to start remediating them. Those are the things that you need to do to get from where you are today to done. And then once we're done with all of that, the next step is actually to do a validation assessment. The validation assessment is where you're going back because you have probably made a lot of changes in that time during that step 7. Probably making a lot of changes to your system. So you're going to come back and look at everything a second time to make sure that all the old information that you collected and that you wrote early on in the process is still consistent, because again, you're probably going to make a lot of changes in there. So making sure that you have everything consistent is going to be really critical. Then you'll fix any issues that you have there, because again, you probably will find some shortcomings when you do that validation pass. And then when you're done with that validation pass, you should actually be in pretty good shape. Now, if you are working on this mostly internally, it's smart to bring in an outsider to do what's called a mock assessment at that point. And oftentimes that mock assessment can actually be conducted by a CMMC third-party assessment organization, or C3PAO. That C3PAO, what they're doing in the mock assessment is they are looking at all the stuff that you've put together. Now that you finally have somebody who's really independent, even if you're hiring Fathom Cyber to do the work for you, we recommend that you bring in the C3PAO to conduct the mock assessment, because we're good, but we start to get close to you. We start to know more about you, and we're less partial at that point, to be perfectly honest. So you want to bring in that third party to come in and help conduct that mock assessment. That C3PAO cannot tell you how to fix any problems that they identify, but they can help identify potential shortcomings that would otherwise prevent you from getting a CMMC certification. Once you pass the mock assessment, or once the mock assessment gives you the information you need to remediate everything, you fix whatever issues are found, then you go through the certification assessment. And usually the certification assessment is at that point really straightforward. I have been in several certification assessments that lasted basically between 7 and 10 hours total, because the organizations followed this structure, had all their I's dotted and T's crossed, knew they were going to pass. The big reason for that mock assessment, you don't need it, but we strongly encourage people to do that mock assessment, because when the C3PAO is hired and they start the CMMC certification assessment, they need to report to the United States Department of Defense that they are conducting that assessment of you. So once that formal certification assessment starts, DoD knows about it. If for some reason that assessment has to stop, you decide that you want to terminate the assessment, because usually it's because you're not passing, DoD gets told about that, and that could set off warning bells. So we strongly encourage you, do the mock assessment just in case there's a place where you stub your toe. This way it's not reported, there's no score held for it, right? You're just going through that basic mock assessment, gives you that confidence that then you are likely to get through the certification assessment. All right, let's go through this in more detail on the other slides. All right, so let's start with the very first step. The very first step here is to understand what information you are handling, because that is the core to everything. Everybody wants to jump, I mentioned before, everybody wants to make CMMC into this hardcore technical thing. The very first thing, CMMC is an information security program. It is not a cybersecurity program. It is about making sure that the information that you are handling is being safeguarded consistent with the requirements that are imposed on that information. So what does that mean? You have this stuff called federal contract information. Basically, any emails that you exchange, any other information that you exchange or create under a federal contract is considered federal contract information. So anything that's non-public. The reason that it's non-public, the way you know that it's non-public, is it hasn't been cleared for public release. Somebody in the federal agency has to clear that information for public release. Otherwise, it's non-public. So again, unless that thing that you're talking about, that piece of information that you're talking about, has already been actively and overtly cleared for public release, it is still federal contract information, still needs to be protected appropriately. Now there is this whole other level of sensitivity for government information, things that are called controlled unclassified information. And for things to be controlled unclassified, or CUI, that information there has to be a law, regulation, or government-wide policy that says that information can or must be subject to limited dissemination controls, and it has to be information that is created by that were received by the federal government. Basically, it's the government's information or information that was entrusted to the government for safekeeping. And again, there's a law, regulation, or government policy that says that that information has to be safeguarded appropriately. Now, the nice thing is when it comes to CUI, the government is supposed to at least put labels on that CUI to make it really easy for you to identify the fact that you are handling CUI. When it comes to FCI, though, the government doesn't have to mark that information because, again, if it's not overtly marked as cleared for public release, if they're giving it to you as a contractor or a subcontractor, it's not cleared for public release. So basically, you're always handling FCI, and there's a good chance that you may be handling CUI depending on the nature of the work that you're doing for the government. So first step, understand what you have, because if you don't know that foundational piece of information, the rest of the CMMC program, the rest of your compliance program when it comes to cyber and information security is just, you're going to fail. So you need to understand what you have. And then once you know what information you have, the next step is to then create an inventory of all of the assets that handle or secure that information. When we talk about handling, the loose definition of handling is assets that either store, process, or transmit that information, or again, the assets that safeguard that information. There's a little more wiggle room in there. Some of the other videos that we have that are available either here or the CMMC Information Institute has some videos that are available as well. There's additional details on CUI, FCI, and other things. Again, if you need help understanding this stuff, we're available. We can help you understand more about especially what is CUI. Those asset lists, as you're building them out, you want to make sure that you're including the people. So oftentimes as companies are building out these asset lists, they forget to make a list of the people. You want to think about who can store, process, or transmit. By that, we mean basically who can access that information. That includes people like your systems administrators. And we're going to talk a little bit later in some of the other videos about how CUI, in order to be able to handle that controlled unclassified information, you actually have to have a lawful government purpose for handling it. There has to be a specific reason for you. It has your participation in or access to that information has to arise because you are helping to contribute to the government contract that stuff is being done under, that is being handled under. So if you don't have a lawful government purpose, you really shouldn't have access to that information. Now that gets interesting when we're talking about systems administrators, cleaning crews. There's all sorts of other wrinkles. Go watch some of the other videos. We talk about some of that stuff. But fundamentally, the first thing is to think about who currently has access to that information. Again, the people that have access to that information. And then the next step is to figure out why do they actually need that information, and can we limit access in some way, restrict access so that they don't have it. The next one is your business processes. How does that information actually flow through your organization? How does it come in? So where did you receive it? Does it come in by email? Does it come in through a secure FTP site? Do you have a OneDrive, Dropbox, whatever it is, where people can drop off that information and pick it up from you? How does that information flow through your organization? Because again, what we tend to see is that people jump right to the technological implementations. They think about, oh, well, Mary has this thing, has a piece of CUI on her laptop, and so we need to safeguard Mary's laptop. And they don't think about the fact that that information came into the system through a router or through an email server or through a whatever, and the whole way that it got to Mary in the first place, and then the way that Mary gets it back out to whoever it needs to go to next. We tend to, again, see these things as discrete pieces, and that just messes up the entire CMMC assessment process. It lays a poor foundation for everything else. So really understanding those business processes is going to be critical. That includes making sure that if you have them, that you're collecting all of your policies, procedures, and other documentation to make sure that you have everything and make sure that it's actually describing all of this, the proper flow of the information. Next step you're going to need, or the next piece of inventory that you'll need, are the technologies. So again, we're talking about routers, we're talking about your workstations, servers, anything else, external services, anything that is used to store, process, transmit, or safeguard that information. You need to make sure that you have lists of all of them. I can't tell you how many times we sit down to do a gap assessment with somebody, and they think that they are really ready for this gap assessment, and then we start talking about, and they'll give us a list of like 2 or 3 tools that they have in their environment maybe, and then when we start to dig into things a little bit more, we find out that, oh well, we also use this other cloud-based tool to as our endpoint detection and response system, or we use this other tool for something else, and the list just keeps growing and growing. The more you can do to lay that foundation again early, there are critical things that you're going to need from, especially if you're using cloud services, critical things you're going to need from those cloud vendors. So it's important to make sure that you have a full list of all of them, because again, it's easy to stub your toe. Going back to that internal network, if you have a more traditional old school, wired network or even Wi-Fi network in your environment, you'll want to think about again all of the equipment that is used on that network. Make sure that you have a full list of everything that's there. Basically, it gets a little more nuanced as you look at some of the different requirements, but fundamentally, if something is sitting on the same network as a piece of equipment that handles FCI or CUI, and especially the CUI, if it's sitting on the same network, it's going to wind up being what's called in scope. So the more you can do to isolate that information, keep the government's information on separate networks, that's going to make your life a whole lot easier. In order to do that, again, you first need to understand how does this stuff flow through, what technologies touch it, etc. Also look at your facilities. So where are you housing that information? Does everything does it all get stored in a server room and everybody just accesses it remotely from their desktop? Or do they download it locally? Do they have paper copies of CUI? Are they taking them to a job site and, like the guy in the picture, looking at them on a laptop? Or are they taking and unrolling giant blueprints and working that way? You really want to make sure that you have a good sense for what facilities are actually used to store, process, or transmit that CUI and FCI, and especially the paper copies, because again, that tends to get overlooked. If you're large enough to have a separate physical data center, right, you want to make sure that you have an inventory, that you're including that data center in the list. There's lots of different nuances that come into play here, but again, until you understand what sensitive information you have and how it flows through your organization, you can't be sure that you're protecting it properly. And that physical security piece is really important, and again, is often overlooked. And then we talked a little bit about those external services. I want to really drive that home, though. It's really important that you have that list of those external services that you're using. And that can include folks like an MSP, a managed service provider, or MSSP, a managed security service provider, somebody basically who's in your environment helping you to maintain the systems, maintain the security of your systems, all of that good stuff, as well as cloud services. So any external cloud service, if you're using Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, whatever it is that you're using, you want to make sure that you have a list of all of those. And again, make sure that you're including in that the tools that you're using from a security perspective, because you'll need to make sure that we have those. We'll in some of the other videos and some of the other discussions, we'll talk about how and why you need that. But fundamentally, you will not have a good, strong CMMC program and system security plan unless you have that full list. Okay, and as I said before, a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? So you have all those lists, and that's great. You have a list of all of the devices that are on your network, for example, but unless I can see a network architecture, a network topology, it's going to be really hard for you to explain to me what the heck, how all these things are related. So putting together that network diagram is going to be really important. Putting together the data flow diagram, showing me, again, where that data comes from, how it moves through the organization, how it leaves, and again, from a business process perspective, how that all happens. That's going to be critical, again, for me as an assessor. If I'm coming in and helping, I want to see that. Even if we're coming in as a consultant, if you don't have the stuff, we can help you build these, but fundamentally, these are things that oftentimes companies can do on their own. And we have on our website a link to various places. If you're not sure what a network diagram should look like, or a data flow diagram, we have some resources that have some good basic links to where you can learn to do some of these things. There is no one right or wrong way to write a floor plan or write a data flow diagram or whatever it is. So don't go too crazy, trying to make it perfect. The most important thing is that you are able to communicate to us. And again, there are lots of different ways to create these drawings. So the most important thing is that you have one and that it is reasonably clear. It doesn't have to be a particular style. The CMMC assessors are not supposed to walk in and expect you to have it done a specific way, have anything done a specific way. It just has to meet certain requirements. These technically, the data flow diagram, network diagrams are not technically part of NIST Special Publication 800-171. They are not part of the requirements overall. However, as a practical matter, it's going to be very difficult for you to pass an assessment without these. So while they are not overtly required, we strongly, strongly recommend that you take the time to put all this stuff together. Those floor plans, when it comes to, unless you are doing an entirely virtual architecture, those floor plans are going to be critical, because then we'll need to see where are the locks and the doors, how does that CUI get isolated, what do you consider to be the security boundary, all of those kinds of discussions. If we don't have a drawing, or if we're not going to come tour your facility, it's really hard for us to understand how and where to draw those lines. And if we're helping you on the consulting side, it's really hard for us to help write out what that looks like so that the assessment team can understand things. So again, those drawings really, 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 really critical. Okay, over the next several slides, you're going to see that I actually will pick up the pace. We're not going to go into as much detail because honestly, those first couple steps are really the core for everything. They lay the foundation. That's where you're going to spend a good chunk of your time. The next piece will be the gap assessment, but these first few are really important. I also don't want to go over all of the details of the CMMC scoping guides. Really important that they are fantastic documents. They're actually pretty well written, especially that they're now in version 2.13. There have been several iterations of them. DoD has actually done a really nice job of trying to articulate its expectations and how everything is laid out, consistent with NIST Special Publication 800-171. So really smart for you to take the time. If you're on the technical side, make sure that you understand the various scoping guides, both the level 1, level 2, and if you're going after it, level 3. Fundamentally, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, these are the assets, again, people, processes, technologies, locations, external services, that are in scope or out of scope for our assessment. The out of scope stuff means that we don't need to look at it. There are times where telling the assessment team, hey, I know I have this thing and it is sitting over here out of scope, and here is why it is out of scope. That is a smart thing in many cases to lay out for the assessment team, because it just helps add some clarity, and it shows that you are being diligent, that you're not just making stuff up in the middle of the assessment. That's never going to give the assessment team a lot of confidence. When it comes to the other assets that are in scope for the assessment, now we're going to put them into one of 4 basic categories: either specialized assets, contractor risk managed assets, security protection assets, or CUI assets. CUI assets, as their name suggests, means that that asset is used to store, process, or transmit CUI. So it is definitely in scope. It is subject to certain kinds of, or all of the requirements in 800-171. It needs to meet all of those requirements. The next step down is a security protection asset. That security protection asset does not actually store, process, or transmit CUI, but it does safeguard the assets that store, process, or transmit CUI. As you can probably guess, that is a really important asset. From a potential attacker's perspective, if they can gain access to that security protection asset, they can either learn information about your environment or take control of that and then conduct all sorts of horrible things in your environment. So the more you can do to ensure that those security protection assets are properly safeguarded, that's going to go a long way toward ensuring your entire system is safeguarded as well. So those are the 2 that are the really critical ones in the CMMC world. Those security protection assets, again, need to be well defined, especially if you're playing with the controlled and classified information. If you're only at level 1, things get a little bit easier, but make sure that you, or if you're only handling FCI, that things get a little bit easier. Make sure you understand, again, because of that inventory that you created, where you are and whether you're handling that CUI. if you have some other stuff in your environment, sometimes you have to have something in and on your network that's on the same network as the controlled and classified information or as the federal contract information, but it should never actually touch those things. So a good example of that might be, depending on how you run your business, your ERP system or your accounting system. That accounting system may never handle federal contract information or controlled unclassified information, but it needs to sit on that same network for whatever reason. But there are things that you can do to help isolate it. You can basically manage the risk, as its name suggests. You can manage the risk associated with having that thing sitting on your network. So you'll want to, if you have those things sitting on that network, you'll want to make sure that you're categorizing them appropriately, because then the rationale behind why it is a contractor risk managed asset and how you're managing the risk is going to be critical for the assessment teams, so that they don't have to look at all of those contractor risk managed assets to ensure that they meet the 800-171 requirements. Again, they're basically exempt from some of the cybersecurity requirements. The last category, the specialized assets, these are generally things like test equipment, stuff that you can't open, you can't modify it in any way for some period of time at least. So there are things that just naturally they may not be patched if there are new software updates for them. Those the specialized assets may not be allowed to be updated because, again, they are test equipment, they are specially certified, etc., and they just can't be moved. There are other categories of specialized assets as well. And again, you want to make sure that you're categorizing everything appropriately, and most importantly, providing rationale as to why and how they are specialized assets, and any steps that you are taking to help mitigate the risk that's associated with having those on your network. So another good example of that might be that you have government furnished equipment and the government doesn't want you making changes to that equipment. So again, kind of like the test equipment, right? You can't make changes to it by contract, but it needs to be on your network. So again, calling that stuff out, having the assessment team know that that stuff exists, and again, what steps you're taking to proactively limit the risk that goes along with it, that's going to be critical. These last couple pieces are things where it starts to get a little more subtle, and that's the point where you really want to bring in a third party like Fathom Cyber to help you understand where and how to draw some of these lines. But some of the early stuff, again, does the asset actually store, process, or transmit CUI? That's pretty much a decision that you can make. Whether something is a security protection asset, again, should be a decision that you can make on your own as well. So a lot of these early steps, again, are things that you can do on your own and can really help you accelerate that CMMC process. Okay, so now that we know what information we have and the assets that store, process, or transmit that information and or secure it, and the categories that those assets fall into, now it's really easy for us to define the scope. That is the set of assets that are going to actually be assessed under the CMMC program, whether that's CMMC level 1, 2, or 3. If you want to do your entire organization, if you're really ready to embrace cybersecurity and you want to keep the entire organization secure, wonderful. Basically, everything's in scope, makes things really easy. You still do want to do those first couple steps because the understanding the CUI flow and certain other things actually come into play later as well during the gap assessment, during the many of the requirements in 800-171. So you're still laying a good foundation. You do still need to collect all of that information. But when it comes to defining the scope, basically you're just going to say that the entire enterprise is the scope. However, what we're finding is that most organizations don't want to do or can't do their entire organization as being in scope. It's too cost prohibitive, it's too restrictive on the way that they do business. It would require them to foundationally change the way certain business processes happen, and it's not going to happen, especially in the time that's left before CMMC becomes real for them. So for them, they need to put in place what's called an enclave. They need to segment off a portion of their network or create an entirely new network that is devoted to the handling of the government's information. And to do that, you can use what's called physical or logical isolation. You use things like VLANs, or you create entirely new networks, or you put everything up in a cloud environment and you isolate everything in that cloud environment. There's lots of different ways to handle all of that stuff. But again, until you know what information you have, how it flows, all of the stuff that we've talked about in the previous steps, you really can't define that scope well, and you can't define what your ultimate end goal is for that scope. So those first couple steps, again, really important. Lay the foundation for defining all of this stuff. Ultimately, scope is the thing that really is the end goal of having collected all of that information. Once you have that list of all of your in-scope assets and you've defined the boundary for the scope boundaries, the next step is to look at all of the stuff, all of those assets that are inside the boundary, and evaluate them against the requirements in NIST Special Publication 800-171. The one important thing that a lot of people are missing today, even though it's been out and fairly well known for a while, 800-171 is referred to in the DFAR 7012 clause. Sorry to get all technical, but the DFAR 7012 clause is kind of where everybody first learns about CUI, controlled and classified information, and the fact that they need to safeguard it in the first place. That's the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, Section 252.204-7012. If you're not that familiar with it, that's where everybody starts to learn about 800-171. They will go to the NIST website. They'll pull up Google or whatever their favorite search engine is, and they'll search for NIST SP 800-171. They pull it up and they see that there's 110 requirements, and they start going through the 110 requirements, and everything looks hunky-dory. The problem is that there's actually another document, and it's only referenced one place in one footnote in 800-171. So if you missed it, not a surprise, but there is a separate document called 800-171A or Alpha. 800-171 Alpha is the assessment guide to NIST Special Publication 800-171. It helps add more color to what an assessor would look for when they were evaluating whether an organization meets any of the 110 requirements. So really important as you are doing that gap assessment, when you're measuring the difference between where you are today and where you need to be, as you're trying to figure out where you need to be, that's actually defined in 800-171A, not just in 800-171. Make sure you have that. Also, DoD published some CMMC assessment guides. Those assessment guides are supplemental guidance to 800-171, 171A. However, they are fantastic. They have some great things. So they are only guidance. They are only there as suggestions, but there are some really great tidbits in there for you as you're building out your CMMC programs. I constantly pull them up when I am guiding clients through things. I am always pulling up copies of the CMMC assessment guides to help whenever the client has a nuanced question. That's the first place I go, because it really just helps you understand what the government's perspective is. Now, while DoD is not NIST, and NIST is the authoritative source for all this stuff, a lot of DoD personnel know what they're doing when it comes to information security, cybersecurity, and some of the feedback that they've provided in there, some of the examples that they provide are actually really good and very, very useful. So if you're trying to do some of this stuff on your own, strongly encourage you go grab copies. Make sure you get copies of the level 1, level 2 assessment guides. They are really, really helpful. Right, and what you'll do is basically, again, you're going to use the information in there. You're going to evaluate where you stand to get today against every one of those 320 assessment objectives, and see where you stand, and are you meeting those requirements. One of the biggest things that people do is they overestimate. They go, yes, we're doing that. They don't have any evidence that proves that they are doing it. If you can't prove it, whether that's through a screenshot, through some document, whether it's a policy, procedure, etc., or something else, then it's not being done. You can't just say yes. You need to actually have that, ultimately, that evidence. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the upcoming steps about the validation piece, but it's fundamental. If you don't have evidence, the answer is really you're not doing it yet. Now, you could, during the gap assessment, go snap pictures and get the screen captures and write a policy and all that stuff. We don't really suggest that approach. We basically take the approach of mark everything as no unless you really have all the evidence and you're really confident in it. Mark everything as not met. There's little harm in being a little more self-critical. There's potentially a lot of harm in being more generous to yourself, because the score that you generate as a result of this, and the score that you will report to the DoD in their supplier performance risk system, you really don't want it to be a rosier view than where you are. You're really better off being a little more self-critical, because you're going to create those plans of action and milestones in the upcoming steps. We're going to actually remediate those. You're going to fix all that in the next several months. And so being a little more self-critical now allows DoD to see that you are progressing on your journey, and you'll get some quick wins on some of the early scores. So strongly encourage you, again, to be a little more self-critical as you go through this process. Now, there probably are some things that you are doing, and that's great. Don't be surprised as you go through the gap assessment if you have a pretty bad score. So the scores for the CMMC process, the what's called DoD's assessment methodology, those scores range from negative 203 to 110. So there is a 313 point swing there. If you have a score of even like a negative 50, that's actually not that bad compared to a lot of your peers. Obviously, it is nowhere near the 110, the perfect 110 that you really need, but even again, a negative 50-ish or negative 100 score isn't all that bad when the scores go down to negative 203. So again, as you're going through this process, make sure that you are critical and self-critical of this whole thing. For the ones that you do meet, though, make sure that you're documenting those and do a good job. Make sure that you talk about because what you're creating is what's called your system security plan. You're going to document in that system security plan, or SSP, what you do to safeguard that sensitive information. You're going to talk about how your company meets each one of those assessment objectives, each one of those 320 assessment objectives. Now, that documentation can take the form of a long written policy, and in some cases, that's really the right way to do things. But in some cases, it may just be a screen capture of a configuration setting somewhere, or a configuration management. Somebody asked you if they could install some piece of software on their machine, and there is a review process that you're supposed to have in place. So you have a piece of evidence that shows that they asked, that it was reviewed by somebody with appropriate authority, and that the review was granted, and so then they were able to install that piece of software on their machine. Right there are some basic things that you probably are doing in your environment already, and so again, making sure that you document all of that as part of your system security plan, that's going to help you with the assessment process. You'll also, again, want to talk about how you do that at the assessment objective level. Most important thing is to prove it. So again, as I said on the previous slide, don't just give yourself credit just because you think you're doing it. Prove it. You need to actually have that piece of documentation. Right. That system security plan is critical. That lays the foundation for you being able to submit a score to the supplier performance risk system. If you don't have a system security plan, you cannot submit a score, period. So you need to write at least a rudimentary system security plan early on. Now that rudimentary system security plan is probably only going to address the handful of requirements that you actually meet early on, if you're like a lot of small businesses that are just starting this today. That's okay. That's a good start. So now the next step is to create what are called plans of action and milestones, or POAMs, for all of the gaps that you've identified, all the places that you're not doing things, whether it's I still need to go get a screen capture of something, or I need to write a policy, or I need to go buy some software to do something, or we need to put in place background checks for all of our employees. Whatever those gaps are that you've identified, you're going to create plans of action and milestones, or POAMs, that help you figure out what that plan is, how you're going to remediate those. For every one of your gaps, you need to create at least one POAM. Every POAM should define what you'll do, when it's due, the impact on your compliance, and the necessary effort, people, and budget. Those things are really important, not purely from a CMMC perspective. You don't really need that stuff technically from a CMMC because you're going to remediate those gaps. So from a CMMC assessment perspective, I don't care if you define this stuff well or not. The problem is if you don't assign the people to it, if you don't assign a budget, if you don't figure out how much it's going to cost, if you don't figure out when it needs to be done, and if you don't figure out the rough order of magnitude for the level of effort that's needed, it's going to be really hard to prioritize things. The budget's not going to be there. Budget's going to wind up other places. So really taking the time to manage this from a project management perspective is going to be critical. And again, you need to assign those low-level pieces of information in order to build out the projects appropriately. Now you're going to use that information to prioritize and again build out those projects. So you'll take all of those individual poems, and if you're like most organizations, you will have somewhere between easily 150 and 250 poems that come out of that gap assessment. So you'll have lots of to-dos. Trying to eat that elephant is really difficult unless you plan it out. If you lay it out with a good project plan and you attack it appropriately, you do it one bite at a time, and pretty soon the elephant's gone. So make sure you execute those projects. Most importantly, meet your milestones. That is the one thing that DoD has been very frustrated about with government contractors. The DFAR 7012 clause that I mentioned before has been around for a long time. It was published in 2016. At that time, DoD told contractors, hey, if you're handling any of our controlled unclassified information, you need to do a gap assessment against 800-171. You need to create those poems. What they forgot to kind of say was you need to create those poems and close all of the milestones or close all the gaps within a reasonable period of time. So what companies did was they created that list of poems and then they didn't close any of the gaps. And so for years, companies have been sitting on poems and sitting on gaps, and our adversaries have been able to get into our network, steal all sorts of sensitive information. There's all sorts of problems with it because companies haven't taken action. So that's been a big source of frustration for DoD. They want you to start moving forward. So you need to make sure that you are meeting those milestones going forward. Those milestones are going to be critical. You're going to have to get everything remediated within 6 months of when you submit your score in the not too distant future. You got a lot of work cut out for you, so you really want to make sure that you are managing those milestones appropriately and not letting things slip. All right, I will get off my soapbox now. Okay, so now that you are done, you have remediated all of those poems, you've closed all those poems, you've fixed all the gaps that you had. Now you've hopefully been, as you're going through that process, you're collecting evidence, you're getting things organized. What we often see is that people have multiple copies of evidence for various reasons, and they get out of sync. So they will create some newer policy, but they'll have an old copy of that policy somewhere else. And inevitably during the assessment, we see that old policy, not the new one, or we see both policies and now we see that there's an inconsistency. And so going through making sure that in this validation pass, your goal is to go through and make sure that you have all of the right evidence. And that means that you have evidence in two forms, what's called adequate and sufficient. So adequacy is, does the evidence prove that you're actually doing everything that you say that you're doing? If you say that you have a password policy that says that all of your passwords are a minimum of 12 characters long, do you actually have evidence that shows that you're setting your passwords to at least 12 characters long? And then sufficiency is, do you have evidence for all of the applicable assets? So if you have multiple tools that let you set the password complexity, we want to see that you have 12 characters for all of those tools, not just one or two of them. So you need to make sure that that evidence is both adequate and sufficient. Again, that you have both a proper breadth and depth to that evidence to be able to really prove that you're doing all the things that need to be done. If you're like most organizations, you will probably find at least a handful of things where you're either missing evidence or, again, there are inconsistencies, other problems like that. And the issue is if you don't go through this validation assessment and you don't clean them up now, there are requirements that are mandatory. So if you stub your toe even a little bit on some of those requirements, you will not get even a CMMC conditional assessment, let alone the formal CMMC certification assessment. If you're not sure about the difference between those, Basically, what DoD has said is that, look, we know that getting to 110, that perfect score, may be a bit of a challenge for some organizations, and we need some organizations to participate in the supply chain, but we can't just let you continue to get away with things the way that they have been. So we're going to require that you at least put in some of the core things, and they've identified those by assigning them a certain number of points, either 5 points, 3 points, or 1 point. If you meet, you must meet all the 5 pointers, all the 3 pointers, and several of the 1 pointers. Otherwise, you will not get your conditional certification. But if you manage to meet all the fives, all the threes, and the 1 pointers that are necessary, and your total score is at least 88, then you can get what's called a conditional certification, and you'll buy yourself 180 days to go back, remediate the remaining pieces, and then you sit for your certification assessment and you're good to go. There is a bit of a wrinkle in there. So when I said you sit for your certification assessment, that certification assessment has to be finished and signed off on within that 180-day window. So really, you want to sit for that certification assessment at no more than really about 45 to 60 days beforehand. So you want to make sure that that certification assessment is scheduled right away, that you're pushing toward a proper due date, and that you give enough time for the certification assessment to play out. And God forbid there's any issues in there, that you have the time to correct anything quickly before the 180-day window is up. So you want to make sure you're doing all this stuff very carefully, get all your I's dotted and T's crossed, and that's what this whole process is about. That's what the step 9 is really all about. And I talked about the mock assessments before. Mock assessments are typically done by a CMMC C3PAO. They are formal but off the record reviews. So they can be done under attorney-client privilege if you want to. They can provide you a list of the findings that would prevent you getting a certification. Most importantly, they do not result in consulting advice. So they can't tell you how to fix whatever issues they find, but the C3PAO can tell you what issues are likely to keep you from getting a CMMC certification. It also doesn't result in a certification, so this is not for score. So it is a formal, it's handled just like a regular certification assessment, but it's technically off the record. It's not for score. But this can be a very, very valuable approach to ensuring that you are really ready for all the reasons that I talked about before, including because you don't need to, the C3PAO doesn't need to report that score to DoD. So if you stub your toe somewhere, if there's especially one of those 5 pointers or 3 point requirements that I mentioned before, if you stub your toe on one of those, you have the opportunity to fix that without it causing any issues. So again, strongly recommend the use of that mock assessment. And at this point, with any luck, the findings from the mock assessment are basically window dressing, right? They're minor changes that are necessary in order to help you pass the assessment. If you've taken this really well-structured 12-step approach, you really are thoughtful about your entire process. You're really documenting things carefully. Again, this step should be relatively straightforward. You'll fix any of the issues that were found during that mock assessment. That is often only maybe a couple of weeks worth of work at most. In fact, it's often just a couple days worth of work, which is really nice. And it sets you up well for that certification assessment. Now, one of the reasons that we recommend that you use your C3PAO for the mock assessment is the C3PAO will have seen everything at that point, and often the mock assessment goes much faster because the whole process has been played out already. They're very familiar with it, with most of your environment. It's really just reviewing any changes that have been made. They still will go through all 320 assessment objectives, most likely, but the process is much, much faster because they've already seen all of that stuff. So while it may seem like it's very cost prohibitive, at the end of the day, running the mock assessment and then the formal assessment right behind it, it is definitely not twice the price. There are a lot of efficiencies that can be gained. So while there is a cost associated with that mock assessment, it again doesn't really double the price of everything. So that's again why we strongly recommend that you do this. And by this point, again, if you've gone through that mock assessment, you should have a high degree of confidence that the CMMC certification assessment will not quite a rubber stamp. It's a bad way to say it, but that it will be a straightforward process. So that is the CMMC journey. That is the 12-step CMMC journey. That's what we strongly recommend. This is what we guide all of our clients through. Um, Different clients come in at different stages of this process. Sometimes we get clients who want to start with that gap assessment. We generally don't go that route. We will often push them back to the early steps, right? Those inventories and everything, making sure that they really have everything proper, because often when we sit down to do the gap assessment, they don't have many of the artifacts that are really necessary to properly define scope. So until you know all of those basic things, it's hard for us to help you. So we strongly encourage you, go through, collect all that evidence, make sure you have those first couple steps right, then come talk to us and we'll help guide you through the rest of the pieces. We understand that interpreting 800, 171, 171A requirements and actually applying them in your environment can be tricky. And that's the part that we like to play. Those are the fun problems for us to help you solve. Identifying whether something is CUI or not is something that, to a great extent, you can probably do yourself. There are nuances. It does get a little complicated at times. I'm not gonna lie, but generally, those are the kinds of things that you can pretty much do yourself. Again, identifying what assets, what devices are supposed to be on your network, and kicking off anything that's not supposed to be there, or again, the people that are on your network and who's supposed to actually handle that stuff, handle the CUI or FCI. That's stuff that, again, you can do yourself. We're happy if you need somebody to help you with that. We're happy to play that role. But generally speaking, those are things that you can do yourself. And from a small business perspective, if you're trying to do this efficiently and in a cost-effective manner, again, those are things that you can absolutely do yourself. And then we'll come in and help you at the later steps to really help guide you through this whole process. All right. With that, I'll wrap up the video. I hope that this is helpful to you. I hope that this provides a good, strong foundation for you building out your CMMC program and gives you especially the first couple steps on your CMMC journey. If you have questions about controlled and classified information, I have a couple books. They're available on Amazon, other places. You can go down, get them from there. Or you're welcome to schedule time with me if you have questions. The link to my calendar is right there on the slide. And I do enjoy talking about this stuff with people. I'm happy to share my time. I also created an organization called the CMMC Information Institute. It's about to be renamed the CUI Institute. But we run a thing called the CMMC Group Therapy Sessions. They are every other Friday at 2 o'clock Eastern. You are welcome to stop in anytime if you have questions. You can listen to what other people are dealing with and the issues that they're dealing with and how they're solving those problems. You can also come with your questions, and we as a group will help you understand how to solve those problems. So if you're looking for help with this stuff, again, you're welcome to grab time with me. You're also welcome to join us at those group therapy sessions. If you search online for the CMMC Information Institute, you will find the link to it, and the group therapy sessions. The sign up for that is right on the main page. All right. I thank you again. I hope this is beneficial to you, and I look forward to helping you with your CMMC journey.